Welcome to Capital Dialogue. I'm Bob Priddy from the Missourinet and Missourinet.com. We're glad to have you with us on our program today. We're going to wrap up this year's General Assembly session. We have two members of the legislature with us to do that. As we record this program, the session is rapidly disappearing in the rearview mirror. And I had to dig out, I'll be honest with you, some material today to look up and see just exactly what it is that they did, because it just changes so quickly when everybody's gone. And it looks like, from what I see on the table in front of our guest, that they've had to do the same thing. The legislature wrapped up in the middle of May after a 4.5-month session. And a lot of intensity went into the last month or so, but that is not to minimize the amount of work that went in during the first 3 months or so of this session. So we're going to talk about what made it, what didn't, and how these folks deal with these things as individual representatives and senators. First of all, on my left is State Representative Jill Schupp, who is from D-Creve Coeur. She is a Democrat. She is a member of the House General Laws Committee, and she's also a member of the Minority Caucus Policy and Member Engagement Committee. She's the leader of it, in fact. On my right is State Senator Brian Nieves, who is from Washington. He is a Republican, and he's the Vice Chairman of the Senate General Laws Committee. You can tell that the session is over with because he's not wearing a necktie. That's the first thing you probably do at the end of a session, is get casual.
I try to avoid that yoke of oppression as much as I can.
How do you, after the last few weeks of a session, when things really, really ramp up, that first weekend after the gavel falls, how do you decompress?
Well, this was my 10th session. And so decompression, I'm not sure if it becomes easier or more difficult. I know that typically what I do is I try to literally escape for just a little while. Bob, I'm one of those guys that doesn't like the idea of a whole lot of new laws. And so sometimes I need to just get away from the process for a little while and, as you said, literally just decompress. And so I try to just kind of get away, both geographically and mentally. This year, you may or may not have known this, but I have a 15-year-old daughter that suffered a traumatic brain injury just at the end of session.
I didn't know that.
And so between her brain getting scrambled and all the activities of session, my brain was pretty scrambled by the end of session. I will mention that she's doing wonderfully. It's literally almost as if it never happened, and so we're very thankful for that. So this year was very unique in the fact that not only did we have the normal rigors of the end of session, but as a family, we experienced a bit of a crisis that got all of our brains scrambled as her brain was scrambled.
So you had time to get away and
absolutely
unwind. How did you unwind after this all happened?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm so glad to hear your daughter is doing well. That's just a terrible thing to happen in any family, so good news on that front. My younger son graduated from college this year, so we've sort of been getting involved with him and making sure that he's set to go on to his next phase of life. He just moved to Colorado. This is the first time after session that I really didn't have much downtime. There are constituents and groups back home that wanted me to come and talk to them and let them know about what had gone on, so I still am waiting for that vacation, which will start in the middle of June, and then we'll get away for about a week and really take some rest time and some time to think things over.
That's one of the things I think that a lot of folks don't realize is the general idea is the legislature comes here and works hard and debates and passes bills and all this stuff, but a lot of folks don't realize how much work is done away from the floor and how much work you do after the adjournment between the sessions. Someday maybe we'll have a program where we just talk about what happens when they're not actually here in Jefferson City. I added up some numbers, and I don't know if my math is correct, but there were about 1,550 bills that were introduced this year. And out of that 1,550 bills, I think 114 were passed. Why don't you people pass more?
Well, frankly, I think the senator and I are going to agree that passing more bills is not necessarily indicative of a good session. I think a good session is about passing bills that really make a difference, a positive difference in people's lives. So I am not disappointed that we didn't pass more. I think that we passed some of the bills that I would have preferred that we didn't, and there were other bills that I thought would have been good bills to pass. But overall, the numbers don't bother me at all.
When you go home and talk to people about the process that funnels things down to just a few bills, what do you tell people about that process and how hard it really is to get something done?
I tell people that we have to remember that really that is the way our founding fathers designed it. Our founding fathers had just escaped tyranny in real life, in a real life sense. And so they established a system by which it would be very difficult on purpose to enact new laws, to impose new laws onto the people. And so I'm one of those guys that finds it very refreshing that it's very difficult to pass laws. And so as a representative, or in this case a senator, still a representative of the people in my district, you know, the people of my district have elected me with overwhelming majorities. And so I go back and unabashedly tell them that I'm glad that very little legislation, you know, numerically, very little legislation actually gets passed, and I think that's a good thing.
If you had to list 2 or 3 bills, especially significant out of that 114, about 100 when you deduct the appropriations bills, 2 or 3 bills that you think make a major difference in the state of Missouri?
You know, I think subtracting out the budget bills in a year like what we just had would be very difficult. You know, I've told people all around the district as I've traveled and talked to folks just in the short amount of time that we've been out of session, that this year's process was entirely dominated by the budget process. You know, you good folks sit there in the Senate chamber with us and hear all the debate and hear how things come to a grinding halt. Well, you know, when you're looking at the fiscal position that the state of Missouri is in, and then you look at all the bills that we have to pay using the people's money, I cannot subtract the budget from that process. I have to look at the budget process as a small victory this year. You know, we were able to pass a balanced budget. We were able to do that without having to raise taxes, without having to make some of the cuts that I think most people thought we were going to have to make. We somehow avoided that. And so really, I think the biggest victory of this particular session would have to be wrapped up in a discussion about the budget and the final project, the final product that came out.
That bill's start in the House, the budget bill started in the House. Is that a major accomplishment of this session that you can
Well,
point to?
you know, I'm not sure I agree with that. Constitutionally, we have to pass a balanced budget, so we're going to do that, and we did that. And, you know, one of the things that we did was we found a way to fund our veterans' homes, and that was a top priority, I think, for all of us. So I'm very pleased. I brought you a brochure today that talks about a project I've been involved with since my freshman term in the House, when we had to cut recording veterans' oral histories out of the budget. So hopefully we can get to that at some point in time. But there are a lot of things that we didn't do. We underfunded K through 12 education, and I think that's a real problem. And as we listen to what we need to do to spur jobs in the economy, which I think is our top priority in the legislature, we didn't do that well, and what we know is that really educational opportunities for kids, making sure our kids are learning and matriculating well through the system, that's what helps spur and create jobs and bring businesses here. And we didn't fund that to the degree that I think we needed to. We had a shortfall based on the foundation formula, and what we also failed to do was to talk about how the budget that we do have, the foundation formula budget, will be distributed. So we're going to have some districts that are hurting.
There are times in the legislature when, to use Senator Nieves' comment a minute ago, when things grind to a halt, that actually is beneficial because that gives you time to work stuff out when people just simply are butting heads and don't seem to be getting anywhere. We're going to have to grind to a halt for a little bit, and we'll be right back.
I don't miss my car, and I feel safe when I ride this bus. A little over a year ago, I got my car demolished. So I gave up on driving, and I'm their best customer. I go everywhere on that bus 5 days a week. That's just part of my life now. I enjoy the camaraderie. The drivers are really good drivers, and they look after us. I just feel safe when I ride this bus.
To find out how rural public transportation can put more life in your day, just give us a call.
Mayday, mayday. I need help.
Vessel in distress, this is the United States Coast Guard.
There are many thankless jobs out there. This isn't one of them.
We're talking about the legislative session that has now come to a conclusion in Jefferson City and talking about some of the things that were accomplished and some of the things that weren't accomplished. A veteran senator many years ago noted that sometimes the bills that don't pass are every bit as important as the bills that do. We're going to try to focus more on the positives in this meeting, though, if we can, with our 2 members of the legislature. Representative Schupp a minute ago mentioned the shortfall in funding for K through 12 education. That continues to be a problem. Is there a way that we can solve that you know of?
Certainly, I think that's a real problem, and I'm always amazed when we do things like this where we bring in people of opposition party and we sit here and we realize how much we actually agree on. I certainly, as the father of 3 public school children, I would love to see us have more money to be able to spend on education. Unfortunately, we have to, as a state, we have to do something very similar to what families have to do, and that is we have to work with the dollars that we have. Now, prioritizing those dollars and figuring out the best way to invest those dollars in our future, not only as a state, but our children's future, is always a very difficult task. And so, this year, if you want to measure very, very tiny, small victories, we were able to fund K through 12 education at a very slightly higher level than last year, certainly still leaving the foundation formula lacking. But what we do is what we can do. And sometimes in a year like this, that, to coin a phrase, we do what we do, and that's all we can do. And so that's where we ended up.
Now, while you fell short in K through 12 education, Representative Schupp, you at least funded higher education flat, which is not the way the governor wanted it to start with.
Right. I was happy to see that we were able to put money back into higher education, that we found ways to do that. As we know, that's an important part of building a good, strong workforce, bringing people in research to this state, and making sure we have people prepared to fill the jobs of this century.
Now, there are those, mostly on her side of the political aisle, who say, we could probably solve some of these problems if we didn't have the lowest cigarette tax in the country. Certainly. Or if we increase taxes on some other sins, if you will. What's wrong with that?
Well, the way I explain it, particularly when I go back home, is I'm not a smoker, okay, but when I look at any of these so-called sin taxes, okay, I have to look at it like this. The quote-unquote sin that the legislature chooses to punish this time might be something that doesn't affect me. But every time we give in to raising taxes on a particular thing, what we do, in my opinion, is we basically feed that specific taxation alligator. And just because the alligator doesn't eat you today doesn't mean that the alligator is not going to eat you next time. So this time it was a cigarette tax, and of course that discussion has been part of the broader discussion for the entire 10 years that I've been in the legislature. But as far as I'm concerned, I never like the idea of imposing a targeted tax against a particular item or a particular activity. And so when people say that Missouri has the lowest cigarette tax in the nation, or one of the lowest, certainly I think that's okay as is. And I'm not in favor of imposing a particularly targeted tax on a particular activity or product.
I'll bet you disagree.
I strongly disagree. And one of the things I will say is we're actually, the funding of our veterans' homes and the funding of early childhood education, those are coming out of so-called sin taxes. Gambling, the entrance fee to the gambling casinos, that money is now going to go to fund the veterans' homes. And the master settlement agreement that is going to fund the early childhood centers. So we do that all the time. We're ranked 50th in the nation in our cigarette tax. It just doesn't make sense to me. And not only do I think that we can use the revenue to support things like K through 12 education, but also what we know is that when we increase the cost of a pack of cigarettes, it discourages more young people from beginning to smoke. So if we can do that, it has long-term not only health effects on those individuals, but for the community and the state as a whole, and we end up paying less down the road in health care.
Now, there are those who say that now that Illinois has jacked up its cigarette tax by $1 a pack,
right,
there are those who say that's going to be good for a lot of businesses in St. Louis, and I don't know if it comes as far out as Franklin County, but convenience stores, people are going to want to come over to Missouri, buy gas, buy cheaper here, buy cigarettes cheaper here. Isn't this good for us?
Well, we're still going to be significantly cheaper even if we bump the price up to 93 cents, which is what I think it's at on the ballot.
Is it your party's contention no tax increase is proper?
You know, I can't speak for the party. I think you know me well enough to know that I find myself at odds with the party many times. I'll just visit something that the representative said, and that is, you know, if we look at the way that we have funded some of these things in the past, or if we were to say, hey, we already do some of that, Certainly that's true, and it is a valid point. But just because we've done something partially wrong, of course, in my opinion, partially wrong, doesn't give us justification to even further that activity and do it even more. Okay, so while I certainly agree that some of these things, veterans' homes, education, things like that, do receive part of their funding or a significant part of their funding from these so-called sin taxes, I don't think that's justification to then increase how much we rely on these sin taxes to get the job done.
How much do you think all of these problems will be solved as the economy continues to improve? Is that the answer? Just the general improvement of the economy?
Well, I think it's going to be a significant help if we can get the economy to improve. During this last session, we did not put into place any good jobs or economic development bills as far as I'm concerned. I didn't see anything that's going to move us forward, and I think we have some great opportunities. And during the interim, when we're all resting, I'm going to be working on some tourism developments that I think will help bring business into this state. And I'll be doing this in a bipartisan manner with community members from across the state. So I'm really excited about that. I think we have to look at new and creative ways to spur economic development. And certainly if we can do that, one of the expectations is that we'll be able to put money back into the budget.
Was this a bad year for job creation bills?
I think what we're experiencing not only in Missouri but nationwide is a decrease in job creation. I think one of the things that probably the representative and I might disagree on would be the idea that it is government's responsibility to quote-unquote create jobs. I think it's government's responsibility to get out of the way and let the job creators create jobs. I tend to believe that whatever government puts its fingerprints on tends to get really messed up. And so I become a little bit fearful when I hear elected officials say that government, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth and say that this is what you said, but it gives me a little bit of pause when it appears as though government officials think that it is the government's job to create jobs. When I talk to the job creators in my area, when I talk to job creators across the state, the biggest thing that I hear is, Brian, Senator, just leave us alone. We just want you people, and when they say you people, they're talking about elected officials, we just want you people to leave us alone. Stop regulating us to death. Stop taxing us to death. Get out of our business and let us run our business. So I would be more along the lines of a person that would say, hey, let's stop regulating business so much. Let's stop being as onerous as we tend to be on our businesses. Let's let our small business owners, our mom and pop shops, let's allow them to do what they do best, and that is to build successful businesses. And in the creation of a successful business, they find themselves automatically in a position to have to hire more people. So to go back to your original question, which was, as the economy improves, will the job market improve? I give that a resounding yes.
Okay, we're going to come back and talk about more of this legislative session in a minute.
Has anyone ever said, you're the picture of health? You look healthy and you feel fine. But that may not be the full picture. Colorectal cancer is the #2 cancer killer. It doesn't always cause symptoms, but it can be prevented. Get screened. Make sure you are the picture of health.
To learn about screening in St. Louis, call 314-879-6392. That's 314-879-6392.
All across Missouri, people are making a difference. AmeriCorps, providing resources to meet human needs. Vista, building better communities. Learn and Serve, promoting the service of youth. Senior Corps, sharing wisdom and experience. Make a difference, be a volunteer. This message brought to you by the Missouri Community Service Commission. For more information, visit movolunteers.org or call 877-210-7611.
The legislative session is rapidly fading from our memory, and soon will be only a matter of records in the journals and old newspaper columns that you read on microfilm. But we have some fresh memories here talking to you today about what happened between January and the middle of May. Representative Jill Schupp, we talked earlier about some of the legislation that made it or didn't make it. Let's talk about workers' comp, because that was an issue that lasted almost all session in one form or another. How did the House deal with this workers' comp issue?
Well, I think the workers' comp compromise that finally passed at the end of session was much better for the Democrats. I mean, we believe strongly that we need to take care of our employees and our workers, and we need to make sure that when they are hurt or injured on the job, that they are given their opportunity to seek remedy in court. And so I think that we left that very much intact. We took out certain provisions that would have included people with things like mesothelioma that occurs from working in certain kinds of environment, that's been separated. We've said that contributing versus what?
Significant?
No, it's not. Whether it's the main factor or a contributing factor, those issues were looked at, and I think the Democrats were very much pleased that those kinds of issues were not moved forward in this legislative session.
The Republicans wanted a lot more out of this, especially the first bill that went to the governor. The second bill covered only a little ground,
right.
But this is an example, I suppose, if you want to look at it this way, of government being the art of the possible. And this was the only possible thing this year.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to say it, and that is that, oftentimes what we find at our state capitol is the art of the possible. And sometimes what we have to do is we have to take very small steps and look at these as small victories. I tell people back home all the time that to keep myself from going crazy, I have to change my opinion of what a victory is. And sometimes a victory is a very, very small step, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And again, it's amazing how much we tend to agree. That's why it's good for us to sit at the same table sometimes. I think I would have to, as a very conservative Republican, say that I agree pretty much with everything the representative said. I do want workers to be protected. I do want them to have workers' rights. I do want them to be taken care of when they experience an injury that is job-related, that happens on the job. I think we just have to be careful about how far we extend what the words "on the job" means. And so this year we took a very small step in the right direction. I'm glad to hear that the Democrats were somewhat happy with what we did. I guess we as Republicans were somewhat happy with what happened. And they say that in the legislature, when you do something that makes everybody equally unhappy, that maybe you've got a good bill.
Criminal justice was another big issue that happened in this legislative session. And I guess I'll think more of this session as the start of a process than something that actually was accomplished. Would I be correct in assuming that?
I think so. I think we're beginning to really take a serious look at how nonviolent offenders are, whether they should be incarcerated or whether there are other opportunities for them. And I will say that, it was Judge Ray Price's vision that we move in a direction that really took a look at this. And today, another related bill that's going before the voters, the end to Missouri's nonpartisan court plan, as it were, Judge Ray Price actually offered his resignation today and said one of the reasons was he felt like the person who follows him needs to be chosen under the Missouri's current plan, the nonpartisan court plan. So that's why he has decided to resign at this point in time.
Representative Schupp has kind of combined two issues at
right.
once. So let's first of all look at criminal justice. This was a big issue in the Senate. Again, do you feel like you just started something this year?
I feel like we took a lot of small steps this year. I certainly agree that when we look at people that are nonviolent offenders, okay, I think we have a tendency sometimes to have throw them in jail or put them in jail and throw away the key type attitude. And certainly I believe in being tough on crime. But when we have specifically nonviolent offenders, and then we look at the fact that it's upwards of some have even said more than $30,000 per year to keep someone housed in jail. We have to look at what is the return on investment? What is society receiving in return for the $35,000 a year it takes to keep a nonviolent offender behind bars?
Changing the judicial plan, the way we pick judges. That was an issue that was very much talked about in the Senate.
Certainly.
Do we need to make that change?
I believe so. I voted in favor of the reforms. I tend to be a person that believes in open and transparent government. I really don't like the idea of how the Missouri plan allows what I would refer to as behind closed doors brokering and the process happening outside the sunshine that's shed on it by the people. I believe in a more transparent process. I believe that the initiative that will be on the ballot that we'll all be voting on will be an improvement over what we have right now. I don't know that what we currently have, the Missouri plan, so to speak, I don't know that it's such a horrible plan that it needs to be scuttled altogether, but I certainly think it's time to reform it at least a little bit.
How will putting two people on that commission make it more open to the public?
Well, because it changes the mixture of that commission, where there's going to be more citizen representation on there at this point. And so, again, small step in the right direction, but as you said, the art of the possible.
Right. Do you think adding two people to this commission makes a difference?
Absolutely not, and it really ends up giving all the power, or most of the power, to the governor, and I don't think that we want to do that. I think that this plan has been a model plan for so many states around the nation. We call it the Missouri Plan. It's a nonpartisan court plan. This new legislation will make this a very partisan, a very politicized process, and I think people are saying to us, let's get away from all the politics, let's get away from the bickering and the partisanship. And I think this brings us into an era of a new kind of partisanship with the election of these judges.
We just have about a minute or so left. Now that we've wrapped up this session, give me, each of you, one or two issues that you think are important enough to carry over for next year.
Well, I think really what we need to look at is the basic formula by which we govern, okay? If we will remember, in the words of our founding fathers, that when government fears the people, in other words, when government has to answer to the people, we have liberty. And when people fear the government, we have tyranny. And so what needs to carry over from this session to the next is a concentration on liberty, a concentration on allowing our people to be free and allow them to make decisions for themselves. And so that tone or that theme of liberty, I think, is one that we need to carry over into next year, and hopefully will spread from Missouri, the show me state, into many other states around the nation.
And you?
Well, I'm going to be a lot more practical and say, look, we have got to do some things to create jobs in this state, and we've got to be looking at alternatives besides just deregulating businesses. We know what can happen in that kind of an environment. We've seen it nationally, and we've seen it in our state. We need to be focused on educating a great workforce going forward. So we need to come back to education, to job creation, which has got to be our top priority. We need to talk about making sure that we're prepared for whatever health care comes down the line, because regardless of whether the Affordable Care Act is in place in its entirety or not, we need to make sure that our people have access to good quality health care in this state. Those are the things that are at the top of my list. So, and taking care of our workers.
Well, after 4.5 months of work, we passed more than 100 bills in this legislative session. Some will have a direct impact on you. Others will have a more indirect impact on all of us. But these people have spent these last 4.5 months doing their best to try to carry out their philosophy and their party's philosophy and your representation. We thank them for their service, and we thank you for being with us on this edition of Capitol Dialogue. We'll see you again next month.